On Thursday, I had the opportunity to go up to Camp Furcroft for the first time and spend the day out there with some of the men of the different churches who volunteer on the board and do the work for the different cleanups, and we were getting it ready for winterization. And it was a good group of 14 of us up there, and just a great time of fellowship with one another. But that's the first time I've had to make that drive down there. And it was a beautiful morning going out. And anytime I get to drive through the Coos National Forest, it's a beautiful drive, seeing all those trees and everything. I grew up near the Tillamook State Forest, so I just like driving through places like that. But it was especially beautiful because while normally you can only see a couple rows into the trees because of how thick the forest is, there was a fog that morning. And what I normally couldn't see beyond was just framed in fog. A very beautiful drive. And just seeing all the different places that I have yet to visit in this area, all the different nurseries, and all the different golf courses. Now, I am probably like many of you when it comes to golf. What I enjoy about golf is setting up a golf tee at the top of the hill and fruitlessly trying to drive that thing as far as I can. And oftentimes that means -3 inches. But that's what thing we did when I was growing up. My dad and I, we would go to Goodwill, just buy a bunch of golf balls and drive them off into the distance, or at least attempt to. But that got me thinking about a story I've once heard that's going to demonstrate one of the characters of God that we're going to be looking at today in our passage. So, one day, there's 3 people going out golfing. And this is a fictitious story, by the way, if you don't catch on to that right away. But we have Jesus, Moses, and someone else. They're all going golfing. And they decide beforehand that to make it fair, they're not going to use miracles or any of their special abilities while golfing in itself. But they're not having a great day. It turns out they're pretty lousy at golf when they don't have all their abilities at hand. And it's just been a long day. And they're getting close to the end of the day. They're on the 17th hole. And it's a beautiful par 5. Off to the right, you have this big pond, nice, beautiful, and still. Off to the left, you have this stream, just long open course. So Moses is the first up to tee off. He puts his ball down, gets ready to swing, goes for it, and just shanks it off to the left, lands in the stream. Moses is not having a good day today. He just hangs his head, shakes it, sighs, walks over the stream, raises his golf club in his other hand, the water parts, he grabs his golf ball, writes down his penalty, and just shakes his head. Next up is Jesus. He's getting ready to tee off. Suddenly, he hears something off in the distance right as he swings, slices it off to the right, ends up in the pond. Jesus, not having a good day as well at golfing, shakes his head, sighs, walks over to the pond, walks on top of the water of the pond, looks down, finds his golf ball, pulls it out, takes his penalty. The third golfer now steps up to the tee, and just like Jesus, not having a good day, swings, slices it just like Jesus did. It's going off, about ready to hit the surface of the pond, when out of nowhere jumps up this giant trout and just manages to swallow the ball out of midair. And just as this trout is ready to hit the surface of the water, an eagle just comes out of nowhere, grabs the trout, and starts flying off with it. And just as it seems like the eagle's about to get away, the one cloud that is somehow in the sky that everyone missed, a bolt of lightning comes out, strikes the eagle, which drops the fish. The fish lands on the green, spits up the ball, and the ball lands in the hole. Hole in one. Moses and Jesus turn in frustration to the third golfer, and Jesus shakes his head and says, "Dad, what did we tell you about using powers?" I thought you might enjoy that one a little bit. But in our passage today, you're going to see a character of God that is going to be playing throughout it. In fact, you have already been seeing it playing throughout the book of Jonah as we have been looking at it thus far. And that is the sovereignty of God. Now, we're not saying God would cheat and use his powers in such a way to make himself look incredibly awesome at golf. Who knows, he might, but he is able to take a situation that looked utterly hopeless and use it to further his purpose. Now, more than just looking good at golf, he is going to be able to use what Jonah intended was an escape from God for his own purpose. Now, that's one aspect of today's message that you're going to see played throughout. The other one is a different aspect, and that focuses more on Jonah himself. Because up to this point, we have only seen him receive orders from God, run away, get on a ship, and the ship befall disaster. But Jonah now is going to be thrust into the role that God intended for him to have in Nineveh, with just a different audience. Jonah is going to be an ambassador for God, much as we are called to be ambassadors for our Heavenly Father. Now, what does an ambassador do? In today's political climate, an ambassador is one sent to a foreign nation to represent their home nation. They're expected to be experts of their language, of their culture, of their history, to relate how we as a home nation desire to have a relationship with you, the foreign nation. And oftentimes, these ambassadors tend to stand out. Imagine, if you would, if I was asked to be an ambassador to Japan. Now, I may know some of Japanese culture and some of Japanese language, and even if I was the most fluent speaker who was able to take part of their culture at every level, I'm sure that the 6'4" half Polynesian guy is still going to stand out no matter what I do. In many ways, Jonah stood out, which we're going to see. But also, you as ambassadors, even though you are uniquely familiar with the language and culture and people of this world, formerly being a citizen of this world, you now stand apart, stand out in unique ways. Now that you, who are sons and daughters of Christ, of God, whose citizenship now is in heaven, are here as God's ambassadors to these people around us who need him. So these are the two aspects that we are going to see played throughout the message. One is God's sovereignty and the way he's able to use the situation for his purpose. The other is Jonah being an ambassador. And in this case, he's not presenting a very good, favorable impression of the people to which he is sent. Previously, we looked at the first 6 verses. Today, we're going to accomplish a little bit more than just moving 3 verses ahead. We're moving about 5 verses ahead. So today, we're continuing on in Jonah 1, starting in verse 7. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots," these being the sailors, "that we may know whose cause this trouble has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lots fell on Jonah. Now, just to remind you, by this point, the sailors have had this storm come upon them. They have cried out to their gods to save them. They have cast the cargo overboard in an attempt to lighten the load so that they may get to shore. And all of this has failed. They've even awoken their passenger and told him to call upon his God. From what we know, what is presented here, we don't know yet if Jonah called upon his God in that instant. Jonah didn't write that down. But if he did, it didn't seem to be working at this point. So now, they know of this storm that it is not of natural origin. They are experienced sailors. We know this from the fact that they are going from one end of the known world, or the middle of the known world, to almost its most extreme end, if their final destination is Tarshish in Spain. But they would have had to be familiar. And for a storm that is so great, threatening to break up their ship in such the manner as it is, there would have been signs the day before, probably a couple of days before. This is their profession. They train to look out for signs such as this. So its sudden appearance and severity that came across them, they are now left with everything else they have done with the conclusion that this is not a natural occurrence. It cannot possibly be. One of us is at fault for this calamity that has now come upon us. The sailors, in this regard, are accurately able to determine the likely source. Some of you may have caught that accurately and likely in the same sentence. They're getting close to the right answer, but not quite there yet. They're not able to fully perceive the exact cause, but they know it goes well beyond their natural senses of observation and their training thus far. And so, in their desire now to figure out what is going on, since their understanding of the natural world has failed them, they turn to methods that may not be considered scientific. They've exhausted everything that they know and understand about seagoing travel. And now they are turning to religion, or turning to other methods that they are familiar with. And this is the casting of lots. Now, just an interesting side note, the casting of lots is actually one of the approved methods in the Old Testament that God gives people to determine his will. In fact, it's used a couple of times in the New Testaments when Matthias is chosen to replace Judas as a disciple. And there's a specific method too, where there's two specific stones called I always get these things wrong, but there's one begins with a U, one begins with a TH. And I forgot them, I should have wrote those two down. But the high priest carries them in his ephod, that golden breastplate, and by which he can determine what God's will is. And this is more than a simple yes or no. Because if you remember, King Saul, when he displeased God, God said, I am done with you, I am not talking to you anymore. So when Saul inquired of the Lord, somehow the high priests were able to give the answer, God doesn't want to talk to you. So they can be surprisingly accurate. So this method that they're turning to is one that God would have approved his own people to use to determine his will. So using these methods, they are able to determine that Jonah is the cause of everything now that is befalling on him. Through all this now, what is being demonstrated is God's sovereignty over the situation. That he not only sent the storm after Jonah, but he's now allowing these sailors to know that Jonah is the cause of all of this. That he is able to affect so much beyond just the borders of Israel, which Jonah thought he was escaping. All of it is orchestrated by God. And at this point alone, Jonah is not presenting a favorable look of who he is as an ambassador of God. In fact, Jonah now stands out incredibly, as we see now in verse 8, where it says, For then they said to him, Please tell us, or whose cause is this trouble upon us? What is your occupation? And where do you come from? And what is your country? And what people are you? Now these questions, some of them seem a bit obvious at the beginning. When they ask, what did you do? They want to know the cause. What could be so possibly bad that the storm comes out of nowhere, threatening to kill all of us just because of you? It's a question that seems obvious, but going back to that ambassador in a foreign land, they asked the questions of him. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you? Now, this goes to show you how unfamiliar the Israelite people at this time were with sea travel. Joppa being the only seafaring port to which trade was open in either the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom that served as the trading hub for the land of Israel. For the sailors who just pulled into a port, the only one that the Israelite people had access to not know who the people were that lived near it, likely the port was controlled by the Phoenicians during this time period. Jonah was one who stood out. They had not seen him before in all their travels. And no, they had traveled from Tarshish to Joppa, all through the Mediterranean, seeing all kinds of people, all kinds of gods, all kinds of religions throughout the area. But Jonah stood out. He was completely unfamiliar to them, where they had to ask his occupation, where he came from, his country, and who his people are. Now Jonah responds to them. But we're going to actually skip verse 9 for just a second, because he actually tells them in verse 10 why he ran away. When you look at the end of verse 10, where it says, "For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them." So while Jonah doesn't tell us in his own words that he fled from the Lord, he does tell them this. So this is important, because when we see the answer that he does tell us he gives, he also tells them the truth. But this is what he considers important to tell the people, to tell the sailors about what is happening. And in verse 9, Jonah said, "So he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Jonah has told them the truth. We're not told that his exact words of what the truth are. But now, this first answer he gives to them, I am a Hebrew. There's two ways of looking at this. For the Israelite people, this gives a simple answer. I am an Israelite, a follower of the God of Abraham. This includes other people than just the Israelites. It also includes people as the descendants of Ishmael, the descendants of Edom. For those people who follow the God of Abraham, although at times those nations did not, the Midianites also count. They are a descendant of Abraham who follow the God of Abraham, as Jethro was the high priest of Midian, worshiper of the true God. That's to Israelites, or people of that region who are descendants of Abraham, what they consider that term to be. But we have access to other records, such as the Assyrians, or the Babylonians, or even the Hittite people that used to occupy that area. And there's a group of people that they describe, the Habiru, which they, in their own literature, refer to as a landless, stateless, social outcasts, shepherding people utterly dependent on our goodwill so that they can eke out existence on the fringes of our land with their sheep, their goats, whatever. It is a disparaging term that was often used to describe people like that. And you can see this in the book of Genesis, when even Joseph, the second in command of all of Egypt, was still despised for being a Hebrew that the Egyptians refused to eat in the same room that he did. Now, this connotation wasn't a new occurrence, but one that had been among the people for a long time. When Jonah then responds, I am in Hebrew, in a way that could be interpreted, who I am, are an insignificant person of an insignificant people. But what is important now follows. I fear the Lord. And there he uses the divine name of the Lord, which often in some Bibles is translated as Jehovah. He wants them to know this is who he follows and who he is exactly. As Jonah describes, he is the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. In the creation myths of the different peoples throughout that area, the most supreme God above all other gods in their pantheons oftentimes is the God who conquers the sea. To the Babylonians, that was the Emperor King Gilgamesh who killed Tiamat. But Jonah's letting them know that what you consider the most important God in any religion, he is the God that I worship. And he now is the God that is causing this calamity upon us. This certainly got the attention of these sailors. For we can see now in verse 10 that the men were exceedingly afraid. Perhaps they thought like Jonah did in the past about these other gods. In the past it said that sailors are superstitious. Well, when your occupation is from sailing from port to port through many different countries, and you think that the gods of the local country you're in are bound to those borders, you may have to worship several gods to have safe travels because you need to appeal to the God of each individual region you're going through. But now, the supreme God who conquered the sea, who now can send a storm outside of the borders of the land that he is supposed to be in charge of, is now pursuing this person who describes himself as an insignificant person. No wonder they were afraid. I don't know if they've heard of any other God who went to such extreme lengths to go this far. In fact, now they ask him, why have you done this? Remember, Jonah ran for reasons that if we speculated on some of them, that he ran away because Nineveh was the home of the people who were known by their contemporary nations in their day of being exceedingly cruel. That he did not want to die, that he did not want to torture. Perhaps he didn't want to go to Nineveh because he thought God could not protect me there. We know ultimately he did not want God's forgiveness to come to Nineveh if we skip ahead to chapter 4. But now, God is showing to Jonah that even you, who think you are insignificant, who thinks you can escape because you go outside the borders that you think I can operate in, I'm able to come after you. And I will. And I will send a storm, the likes of which will frighten even the most hardened sailors. No wonder they were afraid. For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. And now in verse 11 it says, Then they said to him, What shall we do to you, that the sea may be calm for us? For the sea was growing more tempestuous. At this point, they had already exhausted appealing to their own gods. They exhausted everything that they scientifically knew about storms to get out of it. They now had one option left: to appeal to the God of Jonah. And they realized at this point, they inquire of the God's prophet, because they know that there are questions that only now the God of Jonah could answer. We can see God's sovereignty being played out through this passage. And before that, when we saw the ways that God arranged this storm, first a mighty wind, then a tempest, then one that was threatening to break up the ship, And now at verse 11, we see it's getting even worse. And just a little bit of foreshadowing, it'll get even worse in a couple more verses. He is able to use this situation to demonstrate his power. That is his sovereignty. But also, Jonah, as he was called originally to do, to be God's ambassador to Nineveh, is now being an ambassador to these lost sailors. And that oftentimes is how we are called to be ambassadors in our own life. For us, the sons and daughters of God, our citizenship now is no longer of any nation of this earth, but is that of heaven. We belong to him. And he has left us here, appointed us as ambassadors, as Matthew tells us in the Great Commission, to go into all the world and preach the gospel to all people. We are going to stand out because of that. As the sailors noted that Jonah was someone that they had not encountered before, they were able to determine, even not knowing Jonah's God, that Jonah was the cause of what was going on. That when their understanding of how the world worked failed them, that the only course was to inquire of Jonah about his God. There is going to be situations in each of our lives. I'm not the only ambassador of God just because I'm called to be a preacher. Each of you are called to be a preacher. Each of you are called to be an ambassador. And don't think that because the world around you may be lost, that they're not able to fully perceive the glory of God as we are able to perceive it, even as we are, that they cannot identify when something is amiss, because either God is testing, or God is pursuing us, or even God may be blessing us. They're able to see, at least very much, that this defies the science of the world as they know it. And so they may turn to you to answer those questions. Why is this happening? Why is God blessing us the way he did? Why are we being punished the way we are? Right now, when we look at our current political climate, it seems like a lot of punishment is up ahead or currently underway. How many people are turning to us, asking us the answer? And are we prepared to give them such an answer? Do we just say that, well, it's the economic situation of China with their housing market collapse, it's this global pandemic? Or is it our Heavenly Father using the situation, such as the storm, to reach a people? Jonah thought he was escaping from God by running away, that he would not have to deliver the message to a people he hated. God then used that, even as bad of an ambassador that he is, that if we were to skip ahead and see what these sailors do, at the end, they ultimately offer sacrifices to the true living God and take vows to serve him. Now, even Jonah, as a bad ambassador, for the bad mistakes that he went, was able to affect the lives of the sailors of the ship that he was on. Even God can use our mistakes for his glory to reach a lost world. And even we can be used in such a manner. He is sovereign. That is the character we see throughout here. And we are his ambassadors. And he will use us as long as we have us here. We should then strive to be good ambassadors. Ones who can demonstrate the sovereignty of God in the situation that he has placed us in, or he has allowed to occur around us. Because we don't know Who are those around us that do not know God like these sailors and are in desperate need of him? And all they need to do is be told of who he is to ultimately turn to him. Amen.